What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you solo for the time being. This is only a quick intro. I'm about to be joined by Caitlin Cooper, the brains behind Basketball She Wrote, a blog about the basketball played by the Indiana Pacers. Fantastic stuff. If you've listened or watched this podcast before, you know how much we admire and appreciate the work that she does. This is a special interview that I've been sitting on for a while, just with the content churn we've had. I wanted to get it out, but we're putting out the look aheads. There's been breaking news. This is evergreen stuff. I talked to her about her background, her process, influences that she's had, some basketball icks, things that that you can do on a basketball court that will endear you to her. So I think you'll enjoy the conversation. But as part of ensuring that I just want this podcast is big on independent creators, and we're independent creators ourselves, but Grant and I are also, backed by Bleacher Report. So it's a little bit different. We want to give away subscriptions to Caitlin's blog. Patreon does not let you do that, though. I tried to figure out the best way to do it. So here's how we're going to set this up. We will be giving away 5 6-month memberships to the Basketball She Wrote Patreon. What's going to need to happen is, one, I want people who actually watched and listened to what she said. I'm going to ask her about her favorite Outshine Popsicle flavors. Just respond, YouTube, Twitter, get to our Discord, the links in the podcast, YouTube description, whatever, however you can reach me, I will find it in the community. The first 5 people to respond with more than one of her favorite flavors. I won't ask you for all 5, but if you can name at least 2 of her favorite Outshine Popsicle flavors, the first 5 people I will reimburse you for 6 months of Basketball She Wrote subscription. The best way that we're going to do that, I just want proof of a screenshot somehow. You can email it to me. I will give you my email. We can talk about that in the comments, or again, Discord, Twitter DMs, and then I can Venmo, PayPal. We can figure it out. It's only $5 a month. And Grant and I, we have yet to put our content behind a paywall. It's all free. So if you can, please support the Basketball She Wrote blog. And even if you're not going to get it for free, it's only $5 a month. So go ahead and do it. But like I said, the first 5 people to respond to this podcast, YouTube, Twitter, Discord, whatever, with Caitlin's favorite Outshine Popsicle flavors, I will reimburse you for a 6-month subscription to the Basketball She Wrote blog. And I think that people can get a lot of use out of it. Even if you're not a fan of the Indiana Pacers, she's covering other teams, even if it's tangentially, when she's looking at matchups that go against the Pacers, or when she's using clips to break down Pacers players and some of the defenses they're going against. She is one of the best in the business, if not the best in the business. There's not a writer or basketball mind out there that's better than her. And I truly do mean that. And I think when we're talking about supporting people's work or getting an idea for people who are extremely talented and doing it the right way, names that always spring to mind: Caitlin Cooper, Katie Heindel of Basketball Feelings. This is not even just because he's the co-host of this podcast, but Grant is one of the smartest basketball minds I've ever encountered. And the way that he's able to write so succinctly and effectively to make his points, it's honestly incredible. And so if you listen to and watch this podcast but haven't read Grant, that's a must read. Rob Mahoney over at The Ringer, Howard Beck now over at The Ringer is great. Zach Lowe is fantastic. And so those are always names that immediately spring to mind for me when talking about the most talented writers and also basketball minds, where they're able to blend their analysis, communicate it in a way that makes it accessible to everybody, and they have this distinct tone, this distinct voice. And Caitlin is just so good at it. When you deal, I think, in the X's and O's, the nuances of basketball that I think can sometimes fly over a lot of fans' heads, it can be very hard to communicate that. And I sometimes think that those people who are so smart, it can be hard to write that, to effectively demonstrate it for people to digest it, synthesize it, take it in. Caitlin is so good at making what can be at least complex to me, my simple mind, to take it in and be able to really enjoy it. And so she's going to blend that just with a writing style that is so distinct and refreshing that it doesn't feel like you're just, reading another person. If you look at a piece of writing, you're going to know it's Caitlin Cooper's. And she's so good with strong openings and closes. And since she started the Basketball She Wrote blog, she's weaved in more personal anecdotes which I've personally really enjoyed. And she, doesn't like talking about herself. Really, who does? I don't like talking about myself either, but she was kind enough to do this podcast. I thought it was a really fun interview, and I gained a lot of insight into her process. I think you will very much enjoy it. The link to Basketball She Wrote is in the podcast and YouTube description, as well as is her Twitter handle at C2_Cooper. It'll be on the screen throughout, of course. So please go subscribe, become a paying member of the Patreon. And like I said, I will reimburse 5 people for 6 months worth of membership to Patreon. If you can just tell me Caitlin Cooper's favorite Outshine Popsicle flavors per the end of this podcast. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Let's get to talking with Caitlin Cooper. What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Pavalli coming at you without my certified fantabulous co-host Grant Hughes, but I am super excited to be joined once again by the one, the only, the legendary Caitlin Cooper. Is the, what do we call it? Like the head of, you're the author of the Basketball She Wrote. Is that a newsletter, subscription-based model? You should subscribe. The link is in our podcast and YouTube description. You already heard her talk about the Indiana Pacers look ahead, which dropped last week, I believe. She's been kind enough, and I've been asking her for like months now, and she's finally done it. I'm going to ask Caitlin Cooper about Caitlin Cooper. I've been waiting for this. I'm excited for it. I know you all enjoy it. She does such great work. I just wanted to pick her brain about stuff not related to the Pacers. But the question that everyone's dying to know, Caitlin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm always excited to come back and talk with you. And this one's a little bit different because shifting from Indie Cornrows to Patreon, I've told you before we hopped on here, has been a big adjustment, a lot more personal. And like doing this podcast is a lot more personal, which takes me out of my comfort zone a little bit. But getting to do it with you makes it easier. So thank you for inviting me on.
I appreciate you saying yes. I know you hate talking about yourself, but I remember the piece that Stefan No did for the Sporting News, and I used that as my opening. Like, hey, you're talking about yourself. Can you come talk about yourself some more? So I took advantage of that. And yes, if you've not, I'll reiterate. If you haven't subscribed to Basketball She Wrote, please go do that immediately. The link is in the YouTube and podcast description. So I'll start here. I know you wrote about why you named your Patreon Basketball She Wrote, but are you able to just sort of retell our listeners like the meaning behind that?
Right, it's catchy, and I'm a super fan of Murder, She Wrote, right? No, that's not the real reason. The real reason kind of goes back to being a kid and growing up around basketball. My dad was a coach, and I've told this story before, but I was around a lot of coaches when I was growing up in a lot of different gyms, and I directly had one tell me one day that he preferred to coach girls basketball because they didn't know enough about the game to argue with him. And that really stuck with me. I'd like to say that I don't think about it anymore, but it conditioned me quite a bit in the way that I interacted as a player and when I got into doing whatever you call what we do or what I do. So just out of my own paranoia, when I was on Twitter and my byline when I was still Indie Cornrows, my first name was abbreviated. It was always C. Cooper. It wasn't because I was trying to deceive anyone. I just wanted people to notice my writing first and not have an impression based on my gender. So then eventually when my work started getting noticed more and I was doing podcasts, obviously people then knew it was a woman behind the keyboard. But for the entire 10 years that I was at Indie Cornrows, my byline was abbreviated. When I decided to do my own well, actually one way that I revealed it is I ended up on Twitter when I finally did change my name on Twitter to Caitlin. I used an avatar of a typewriter and I put the words Basketball She Wrote on the piece of paper. So when I decided, Indie Cornrows came out to an end, the lights got turned off and I was like, I need to come up with a name for this. I was like, I think that's the perfect name. And it kind of just is me embracing that journey and realizing that for everyone that got to know me as a writer first and a woman second, I hope that everybody knows and enjoys me as both now. So that's kind of how the name came into being.
Has it changed at all, like going from Indie Cornrows to something that you just fully run, operate with Basketball She Wrote? Does that change how you cover the team? Any challenges or any benefits of just covering the league fully independently, I guess would be the way to frame it?
I think the best way to describe it is that it's a lot more personal for reasons both good and bad. I think that if people go and read my work over there, there are more personal anecdotes. Sometimes I do a mailbag that's patron only and people ask me more personal stuff about me. They'll ask me, jersey aesthetics or stuff when I was growing up, or recently somebody asked me if I would ever consider coaching with my dad in a mailbag. And I actually did like a fun phone call with him during the mailbag video. So that's not stuff that I would have ever considered doing at Indie Cornrows, but I feel a little bit more comfortable sharing myself because it's people who are investing in me. Obviously, if you're paying me money to read my work, you probably like my work. You want to get to know me a little bit more. And I think that that's only fair. And then on the other side of it, it's more personal in that, I think about the business of writing a lot more now. And it's a weird thing to say and a weird thing to think about. Like when I was just filing stories at Indie Cornrows, I of course wanted to do my best work and publish my best work there and do my best for that website. And the same is carried over here now. But when you're the publisher, the editor, the writer, the owner, and you're trying to make money in this business, you have to think about things a little bit differently. And you do notice what your numbers are. You notice when somebody cancels a subscription, and you take it a little bit more to heart than when you're just seeing, oh, I didn't get quite as many clicks on that article. Like it's a nameless click versus it's a person, potentially canceling a subscription or signing up after they hear me on a podcast or after they read something. So it's a lot more intimate experience all the way around, I guess is how I would say the adjustment has been.
I don't mean to put you on the spot with it, but do you prefer it like what you're doing now or to what was happening at Indie Cornrows? Or is it just sort of like it's still an adjustment period?
I think it's give or take. I mean, I like the fact that there has been somewhat, a freeing and empowerment thing that I have been willing to reveal myself a little bit more. I'm usually a very private person, and the fact that I am doing mailbag YouTube videos where people can watch me drive to locations and do things with my sister, that's not something that I would have been comfortable even thinking about doing 2 years ago, but having the people that are investing in me has made me feel comfortable doing it. And I do think that that's a good step forward, both professionally and personally. So that's been a positive of it, I think.
In the sporting news piece, you had mentioned that your dad was a basketball coach. Is that the genesis of how you sort of fell in love with the game, or was there something different that was responsible for that? And I'm definitely going to ask you which Pacers players you were cutting out of magazines when you were young.
Yeah, I mean, my dad started coaching when I was a 6th grader, I think is how old I was. And I already loved basketball before that. I was going to basketball camps from the time I was in 1st grade. Certainly him being a coach and me being around it in a different setting and seeing what goes into being a coach and going to scouting trips was a lot more immersive and grew my love of it more. And I think altered when I was no longer a player, kind of the way that I see the game. But I guess if I was connecting my Pacer memory and when all of this kind of came into being, it was probably the Pacers New Jersey Nets series in 2002 when Reggie Miller had that kind of iconic game that went into double overtime, win or go home. And obviously the Nets ended up winning, but he forced each one of those overtimes first with a three and then with a dunk. And what I remember most about that game is I watched it at my grandparents' house. I was obviously very, very young. And I remember I was watching my dad's reaction to it almost more than I was watching the actual game. And that was when I really fell in love with the Pacers. I do know that I had watched Pacer games before that, but like just the familial aspect of it. And growing up here in Indiana, I think that was probably my earliest memory.
So which Pacers was it? Reggie Miller? Is that who you were cutting out of magazines?
No, I mean, at that age, when I was in junior high, it would have been, the Rick Carlisle, Jermaine O'Neal, Ron Artest, Al Harrington, Jamal Tinsley team. If any of those guys were in a magazine, they were getting cut out and putting on the locker wall.
I will say you might be the only human being in existence that was cutting out little Rick Carlisle photos. I can't imagine that being.
I was not cutting out pictures of Rick Carlisle. I was cutting out pictures of the players. I was just saying it was a Rick Carlisle coach team.
Oh, okay. So the stuff you write, talk, tweet about, it's just so ridiculously high level, also granular. It's so unique. When you're watching these games, and I know you said, I think that you watch every Pacers game at least twice. What sort of goes into recognizing so much, and it's so effectively, but it's just so much, all this stuff that's happening, whether it's on the sidelines or in a possession, when you're watching it in just sort of real time? Like, is there a specific aspect of a possession that you naturally gravitate toward? I'm always fascinated by people who are so good at the recognizing and describing the functional X's and O's aspect of the game, how they're able to process these things in real time.
I mean, I think that the short and simple answer to that is that's why I watch it more than once. I don't think you can take all of that in one view. And I actually talked to a reporter about this once who goes and sees games live in game. Most of the time I'm remote. And I think that there's things that you miss from both sides of it. Like when you're in the arena, you're seeing things happening on the sidelines that you're never that cameras might not be showing you. But when you're watching it remote, you see different angles. You see sometimes they'll close up on coaches. You'll see more play signals than what you might see from the media section at a game. So I think on rewatch is typically when I catch more things. It will more so during live action, I might take a note and be like, oh, that was something. But as far as like what I watch or look for in general, people ask me that a lot. Like, how do you learn how to watch basketball? And the number one tip that I typically give people is don't watch the basketball. Watch what's happening away from the ball as much as you can. And then I think that you start noticing patterns. And once you notice, like, oh, that's something they do frequently, that's actually a play, then you can see what happens when the play breaks down. And I think that your understanding grows from there. But like in my type of writing, I gave this a lot of thought when you asked me to do this. Like, what exactly is it that I'm watching for? And I think that the best way to distill it is I'm looking for abnormalities. I'm looking for what's different or what's other for reasons both good or bad. Does something stand out? And then why does it stand out? And trying to connect those clues and then write a narrative from there. So that could be, almost anything. Is it an abnormality in terms of, hey, Tyrese Haliburton jumps a lot and more than a lot of people. And is this actually a good thing or a bad thing? Like that's kind of what the initial, germination of it is, I think.
Is there like a particular environment or setup that you prefer to have when you're watching games? Is it like if you're watching a game for the first time, are you on social media? Are you cutting up stuff? Or is it you have a notepad and you're writing down notes and you have to be sort of laser focused without other, multitasking distractions?
Yeah, I'm typically watching it live just on regular TV, and then I have notes, or I'll do it in a notes app on my phone. I do some live tweeting, but not as much as I used to. And I will say that I never am seeing what anybody else is tweeting, which is kind of sad. But like whatever I'm putting out there is just like stray thoughts that are just coming straight from me because I can't be focusing on what all the other tweets are going on. And like if I'm looking at social media, then I'm not focused on what's happening up during the game. So typically, like sometimes I'll scroll through that after the game's over to see what the general consensus was. And a lot of times I'll be shocked because I'll be like, oh, wow, it's kind of like watching Team USA lately. Like I'll get done. I'll be like, that was not my takeaway from that game.
So you already mentioned the Tyrese Haliburton jump passes. You wrote a wonderful piece. Was it in August or was it September at that point about Myles Turner and jump balls? And you said you're watching for abnormalities. What is sort of the process though that goes into identifying those abnormalities and knowing whether it's story worthy or not? Is it a light bulb that flashes once and you're like, oh, I have to watch for that moving forward? Is it a story that sort of marinates in your head over time? Like what goes into, is it hard to even identify and then think of these abnormalities? Because the pieces like those are just so gloriously unique that I'm just wondering how much thought and effort has to go into not just executing them, but conceptualizing them.
I think a big part of it goes to this is why I value single team specialists a lot in this arena for this type of writing. Because if I'm not watching every game that the Pacers play, then I'm not going to notice if something's different from the norm. Like if I just zoom in from the top, like this happens to me. Like if I'm trying to do a Central Division preview or go talk about another team, I'm not going to know about it as in depth as somebody who's on the ground doing that 82 games. So in Tyrese's case, like, yeah, you might from the first few games be like, wow, this guy jumps a lot, but I'm not sure it would stand out to you unless you had seen him do it for the 26 games that I watched when he came over and been like, this keeps happening. What is, and I had a pretty good idea before I tracked all this that was going to end in good results, or at least I crossed my fingers really hard that it was going to and be supported by the numbers, which fortunately it was. And I just think that like my favorite story that I've written since shifting to Patreon was one, I think this will explain what I'm getting at really well, that Tyrese made a game winner against the Chicago Bulls. Patrick Beverley was shading him left, and he hit a three, stopping him popping to his left. And the story that I wanted to write when that was over, which Tyrese spoke about publicly, was that he went against what the play call was from Rick Carlisle on the sidelines. And you could see Rick on camera being like, oh, you have something else? Like, okay. Like, was very amenable to Tyrese doing that. I knew that before Tyrese even said it because I had watched enough Pacer games that I knew what hand signal Rick Carlisle had used and that Tyrese did not run the play that Rick had called. And I just thought that that was very monumental for where their relationship had grown in a year's time from when Tyrese, during overtime against Oklahoma City a year ago, was literally slowing the pace to stare at the sideline to see what play they were supposed to call. And that he made the read based on what he knew Patrick Beverley was going to do, and that was the play call that they needed in that moment. If I hadn't watched the Pacers play every game and be rewatching that, that's not a story that I can tell, because I wouldn't have known enough to know that Tyrese didn't need to run that play. So that's kind of, I think, why being a single game specialist isn't as much of a negative as it can be billed at sometimes.
You're free to no comment this if you would like, but has any team, player, coach been like, hey, you're blowing up our spot here? Like when you're recognizing like these hand signals when you're able to relay that piece of information?
No, and I don't think that they would. I mean, I did have one coach ask me, like, those are correct. How did you know that? Or how do you know what they're doing? And I said, just watching it off the broadcast. I go, a lot of times, like, the broadcast can pick it up. Like, it's echoey Jim. You can hear what the call is. And so, like, anybody, like, it's kind of like going back to, like, this Raptors-Knicks things, which obviously I don't know the whole details of how, like, these play calls got taken from the Knicks to the Raptors. But, like, anybody watching the full game tape can see what, the signals are. You just have to be paying attention to what then goes on at the court at the same time.
And I would never personally just never be able to do that. I could watch it 10 times and it's just, there's so much happening. And one of the, you just said something that I received, one of the earliest piece of advice is when I started was, it was in regard to defense, but it was like, don't watch the ball, watch what's happening around the court. There's so much happening around the court that I just can't take it all in. And so I'm constantly in awe of you and other people who are able to, I don't care how many watches it takes you, that you can distill down every granular level of a play from its genesis, where it's like, oh, that's the hand signal. This is about to happen. That's otherworldly shit to me. I'm not going to lie.
I think that mainly, like, and some of this, I said earlier that, like, I was watching my dad's enjoyment of Reggie Miller forcing overtime. Like, I wanted to go on pretty much every scouting trip that he went on originally because I was playing and I thought, watching as many games as I could, I was going to get better as a player. And when I was no longer playing, I'm watching this from, my dad's perspective, and I want his team to win games. So, like, I would watch him on scouting trips, and that's what he was always doing. Like, it was his job to know what plays is the opposing team running and what type of defense are we going to run when they run those. So, like, he was always watching hand signals, always watching what play calls were. And I always was like you, I was always marveling at how much he could take in when we were sitting there live in a gym. So that kind of trained where my eye goes, I think. Like, as an adult now, I think I noticed that, like, oh, I'm doing what my dad used to do at these games.
One of the other things that I really like about your stuff is you're good at recognizing and explaining what's happening. So like that diagnosis, but then there's also prognosticating, where it's talking about or recognizing what teams could do to counter, what they could do to address this, whether it's even can be resolved with the current personnel. Then you also you call it Draft Caitlin, which is an amazing version of Caitlin. And even just and I know you're not like the biggest fan of hypothetical trades and free agency stuff, but one of my favorite pieces that you wrote was when the Pacers were thinking about and ultimately gave DeAndre Ayton, like, aside, one of the most kindest match me offer sheets in the history of offer sheets, basically. But like, you were able to break down what you thought his fit would be with the Pacers. You had talked and written about Jarris Walker before he was even on the Pacers. And even now talking about Bruce Brown, I guess it's a twofold question. What's more, one, enjoyable, but two, more challenging for you? Is it the diagnosis and prognosticating aspect of this? And feel free to correct me if I'm just like framing that the wrong way, or the like conceptual, theoretical fits of players, draftees, free agents, who haven't yet taken the court with this team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my preference is always going to be descriptive and describing why teams won or lost rather than being predictive and prognosticating. I think that that's really difficult, and that's like what front offices have to do. That's what coaches have to do. That's what scouts have to do. They have to be able to see, somewhat into the future and know, like, that's what counter is going to be and what are we going to do if that happens. I typically like to look back at what just happened and explain to you why it happened. But we don't always get to do that in this business. Sometimes we do have to stray into, hey, how does Jarris Walker fit on the Indiana Pacers, even though I've never seen him play a game at the professional level? And you do have to try your best to make educated guesses, or like, not a lot of time to prepare when the Pacers make a blockbuster trade for Tyrese Haliburton and you don't expect in any way, shape, or form that Tyrese Haliburton is going to be playing for your team. So like that particular night, I spent the entire night up. I watched several Kings games in a row, tried to get a better feel for his game. Obviously, I'd watched the Kings play before. I'd watched Tyrese play before, but not with the expectation of what he would be doing for the Pacers. And then it just kind of becomes, hey, what were the problems that the Pacers were having? This is my process. And like, oh, well, teams are going under against Karis LeVert a lot when he's on ball. And oh, Malcolm Brogdon can't really shoot going to his left, and he typically only drives. So if you get Tyrese Haliburton and he's good at, pull-up shooting and stopping and popping, he's also somebody that you would want to weak to go to his left, but for the opposite reason, because he isn't going to drive. He's going to be more likely to shoot. Then it just becomes, I'm going to write about that. I'm going to write about how he addresses these problems. And I think that's typically the way that I look at it, or even with Bruce Brown. Like, what's something that the Pacers were missing last year? Now I'm going to go watch his game, and how does he address those things? That's a little bit easier, especially when it's at the NBA level and you have actual NBA tangible results to go off of, versus when the draft, I think, is just so difficult. I do not envy people that make actual draft decisions. It is hard.
Yet another thing, if anyone can't tell, I don't even care that I'm totally fan personing right now about your work that is just so cool, is a lot of people who can provide or identify the information and relay the information that you do. They're not, I don't want to be brutal here, but like writing is not a forte of theirs. I think might be the kindest way to say it. Like a lot of their stuff can be dry. It can need a lot of heavy editing from people outside the writer itself. You have a very distinct style and tone. The stuff you talk about, I think, like for me at times, it can be complex, but you make it so accessible because of your writing style and tone and the way you describe that. Is that something that you focused on developing over time? Did it come naturally? Do you have like some secret Pulitzer background that we don't know about?
I think that a lot of what I do probably comes from the standpoint of, I have a background in history. I studied history in college very extensively.
Okay.
And this is kind of what you do when you're writing papers. Like I actually looked up something I wrote from many moons ago and remembered what my professor wrote on the paper. I was taking an upper level Russian history course, and it was about the Chronicles of Novgorod. And we were just assigned, write something that you noticed from this primary source and, synthesize it. And at the time I was like agonizing, like, oh my gosh, I'm not noticing anything. I'm not noticing any patterns. What details am I going to write from this? And I ultimately end up thinking, I think that there might've been a shift in who the actual writer of this was. And that there ended up being like a Muscovy bias in terms of like religion and politics after the shift. And so that was the paper that I wrote. And my professor answered back and was like, I've never seen somebody make this connection before. And this is the most like minute detail, but it was really well done. But this is not what I was looking for. And I feel like that's what my basketball writing is a lot of the time too. Like in history, you kind of have to be a detective looking for clues. And you're kind of, I feel like I was always in that field, magnifying nuances a lot and looking at like hyper granular topics to make what arguments I was going to make. And I think that that still parlays into basketball and why I am as detail oriented as I am. And I never wanted my writing in history to be dry either. That's something that I work really hard at, that I want people to walk away from it. When I have, sometimes I'll give it to my sister, which my sister does not really enjoy basketball. And that's the exact reason why I'll have her read it. Cause I'll be like, were you bored?
Okay.
Did you hate this? Did you understand it? Like, do you walk away and get what I'm talking about? And I use her as my litmus test, because if she can walk away from it understanding it and didn't think it was, the most dry thing she's ever read, then I'm like, I did something there. I've accomplished the task.
That's a great way to do it. And that's a level of thought in the product that I don't think most people, including myself, when I put stuff out, would think to do. Are there, aside from your dad, obviously, have there been any, whether it's writing influences, basketball influences, when it comes to how you evaluate or think about the game in your life that have particularly influenced you to reiterate the word, or just lessons, whatever they've told you that have stuck with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think my understanding of the game predominantly comes from my dad. That was the person that I went to a lot of the time when I was growing up. Obviously, I was around other coaches because of him. I mean, I'd be at scouting trips, and if it was a high profile game, there'd be coaches from a lot of schools that would be sitting there. And of course, they weren't going to engage with like a 12-year-old daughter about what they were thinking and seeing, but I was always listening and taking in what they were saying. So that was a big part of it. And then at the writing level, and I hope people don't take this the wrong way, but it is the truth. If there's national articles written about the Pacers, I try really hard not to read them because I don't ever want my work to be derivative. Like, and it's writers that I like. I just always read them when they're writing about other teams. And so I don't take in a lot of Pacers content. I try really hard not to, so that people are getting what my opinion is, or what my, if you want to use the word take, what my take is. But I do have several people I admire, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting here talking to you. I really do admire your work and your writing verve. I've compared it before, but like I read pieces that Rob Mahoney writes, and when I get to the end of it, I'll be like, I'm never going to write a sentence that good. Why do I even do this? And I feel similarly when I read your stuff sometimes, like when you do your player rankings, like I do not care about player rankings. I genuinely do not. Like you can put the Pacer players wherever you want to. Like you can have Tyrese as high or as low. I'm not going to have any reaction to that, but I do go for the blurbs, and you are very good with the blurbs. Rob Mahoney also very good at the blurbs. So those are two people that I read a lot. As far as like actual analysis, I think a lot of Mike Prada. I really value the way, like with the book that he just published, that he can explain very complex topics and he doesn't rely on film or, static screenshots in that book. Like there are some graphics and some, core like X's and O's, but very minimally. And you still totally understand what he's talking about. And then also I really like Samson Folk and Louis Zatzman at Raptors Republic. I think the best compliment that I can give Samson is that if you gave me one of his pieces of writing and I did not know that he wrote it, I would know that he wrote it. And he also knows the game inside and out. And I just think Louis is like a genius. Like he can relate anything to basketball. Like give him any analogy. Like I literally read a piece from him last year about Gary Trent Jr. comparing the tulip market and in the Netherlands, and it made perfect sense. It made perfect sense. Like it was a tremendous article.
You turned me on to Samson Folk, who is really good. Also, Rob Mahoney is on the Mount Rushmore. Yeah. I would have to flesh it out. Katie Heindel's definitely there too. Of all like Mount Rushmore of read them and feel bad about how you're writing.
Bad about yourself, exactly.
Yeah, they're both on that level. So this is one I've talked to you about. I know you've dabbled in it. I know you've been reluctant to and said that you don't necessarily want to do it. And I'm imagining fans. I'm not imagining. I've seen fans from other teams try to recruit you. Have you ever given any thought to branching out beyond like Pacers coverage and doing more league-wide stuff? With the caveat that you did just go on a Central Division preview podcast with Danny LaRue on the Real GM, which was fantastic, by the way. But have you given any thought, or did you ever have any desire even to branch out beyond just covering the Pacers?
I mean, I think about it. I wrote the piece about Eric. I mean, it really wasn't about Eric Gordon. It was about defensive perception and spacing in general at 538 a couple years ago. And what I would tell people of that piece is that came about in part because there was rumors that the Pacers might acquire Eric Gordon. So I started watching film and I noticed like the way he's being guarded is really interesting. That's a story that somebody should write. And then it was actually my vacation. Like when I was still at Indy Cornrows, we would get a half quota in August and September, which would allow me to do like deeper projects. And so I spent my vacation writing that piece for 538. It took like 2 weeks. And I think that that's the thing that maybe everybody doesn't fully understand is that I think the reason people like me is because I am only covering one team. Because this is the level of work that it takes to produce those types of pieces. If I was doing all 30 teams, I don't think it would be me anymore. And at that point, like, I think the writing is better when you're interested in the topic that you're writing about. And like the night before I did that Central Division pod, I was very grateful that Danny asked me and I worked really hard on it. But I was talking to a friend in this space and I told him, I was like, I'm doing this Central Division pod tomorrow. And I was like, I'm nervous. I just think all of my takes are so basic. And like when I got done off of it, I was just like, I didn't say really anything that in depth about those other teams. Like it didn't feel the same to me. Like, and I just didn't feel like me. So
I get it not feeling the same, but I would push back heavily that that was not a derivative like podcast by you at all. That was everyone should check it out. It's Real GM. It was the Central Division. So I mean, maybe you're just inherently more familiar with those teams because they're in the same division, but I didn't. and you
Oh
should
no,
enjoy
like
it.
it was like a freaking week of work. Like I spent like 2 or 3 days preparing for each team so that I could share my very basic takes.
Yeah, you don't want to. They weren't. First of all, they weren't very basic. But you don't want to stress yourself out to that degree. I did not ask you this in the outline I sent you, but if you could cover one team that wasn't the Pacers, have you ever thought about which team that would be?
Oh, it probably would have been the Nuggets. I know that that's going to sound very bandwagon, but if you had asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, it still probably would have been the Nuggets. I just in part because I don't think Jokic seems like the type of player that would stay put. It would still need to be a small market because I just I value very much that I've been in this sphere covering the Pacers in the state where I grew up, covering a team that not a lot of people cover. And I'm not sure that my work would have gotten noticed if I was in a bigger market with a lot of different writers doing the same type of writing that I do. But I also just really like watching players like Jokic, like Tyrese Haliburton, and trying to understand the way that they process the game and trying to figure out how they operate as supercomputers. So I think that would be a really fun star to cover. And I do think that I like the model that DNVR uses a lot. I think that's cool. So yeah, it probably would have been the Nuggets.
I would read a lot of Caitlin Cooper on Nikola Jokic. I'm not going to lie about that. I would also, the team that I would be most interested in seeing you cover would be the Thunder. I just feel like you would have a ton of interesting stuff to say about them. So that would be my pick for you. I finally have some lighter fare questions before I allow you to go.
Okay.
Are you ready for these?
I'm ready.
So let's start with, you briefly have pulled back the curtain on player Caitlin. What was the defining skill set or trait or attribute, whatever, of player Caitlin?
Player Caitlin in my mailbag was mainly a story about how obscenely large my uniform was because we got assigned uniforms based on our height, and I was one of the taller people on my team. And then the next year, I got told that we would get to pick our numbers, which was true, but I was the youngest player on the team, so I got to pick last, and I still had a way oversized uniform. But beside the point, actual play style, it's funny because I literally asked my dad this question within the last month. I was like, okay, people always say, like, if you were going to compare your game to an NBA player, like, who would that be? Like, not that I'm as good as this NBA player, obviously, but he sat there for like 20 minutes. I'm not joking. And he's like, this is really hard. And I was like, I know, because as a player, like there wasn't a way to describe me. Like from 6th grade until I was no longer playing, I played every position but point guard. So do not compare me to any point guards because that is not applicable. And I'm 5'6". I was very good at rebounding for my position. I averaged a large number of rebounds over my career. And then I played with my back to the basket a lot, despite being undersized. So my dad ultimately came up with Charles Barkley. Am I a future Hall of Famer? No, I was not. But he said that that's what he thought was most comparable. And I will let people know that we ran a shuffle motion offense. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. And that skill set is not very useful in that type of offense. People can probably figure that out. But that was my role. So if I got to ad lib within sets, I was typically posting up and wanting to use some type of Jermaine O'Neal footwork that I had watched from a DVD and try to put that into use. So as you can tell, I made a lot of sense to be a 5'6", very skinny forward in an oversized uniform as the youngest player on a team playing a back to the basket game and motion shuffle offense, grabbing every rebound.
Okay, so whether it's about covering the league, watching the game, if you're a player, what is Caitlin Cooper's biggest basketball ick?
This is something I actually tweeted as a prompt. My number one basketball ick, and if I watch this and it happens, this was literally the reason I tweeted out that prompt that day, is I can't stand it when it's after halftime or a coach calls a timeout and you can very clearly tell that a player does not know what the play was. That they weren't paying attention to the huddle and they don't know the play, and then it screws it up, and somebody else on the court's having to tell them what to do.
Are
That's
we like
my number one ick?
Are we just throwing shade at Christian Wood right now? Is that what's happening?
I will say that there is a player on the Pacers within like the last 5 years who is a very repeat. You would see them. This would happen fairly often where they would not know the play. Like I would know what they're supposed to do if they're coming out. This is how I knew they were messing it up.
That is actually incredible. And if you're the coach of the Pacers, somewhat concerning. So I don't think there's a term for this. And if there is one, I'm too old to know it, apparently. What is Caitlin Cooper's basketball beloved? If a player or a coach does this, or even if it's a fan, something with covering the game does this, that they're going to be ingratiated to you for an indefinite period of time.
I forgot one of my basketball icks too is when a coach like has to make the really exaggerated like this signal, like go to the other end of the court fast. It's like, no kidding, that's what way we're supposed to go. Like it's demonstrative and it's icky. But no, so basketball beloved. Yeah, I would say that this is gonna sound very like old school, but if a player plays hard regardless of time or score, you will probably have my heart. So like there's a play in summer league where like the Pacers were up like 20 with like 2 minutes to play and Andrew Nemhard's still like going really hard on defense. Like that's just tremendous. I had to clip that. I had to share it. And then also like something that I've been focusing on a lot lately is players who, if a play breaks down, can continue playing. So play breakdown progressions, or my new thing that I like on defense is I've come up with this theory that if you can, we talk a lot about unique movers on offense and people that attack defenses uniquely. We don't really think about that with regard to defenders and people who can attack offenses uniquely without compromising scheme. So if you're somebody who can help from like an abnormal position, or you move in a way that's different than other players move doing that same role, you will also have my heart forever and always.
My final question, and maybe the most important question: what are Caitlin Cooper's top 5 Outshine Popsicle flavors?
Oh, now this changes a lot. It's a living document. It's much like, you got to keep adjusting these, but strawberry will always be the GOAT popsicle. That's my staple box that I always keep at home. And then I typically have one other box and I rotate it, but I would say that at the top of the board, grape and peach are going to be there. I've recently come to really like lemon, and not every store will sell just a box of the lemon, but that's really good in the summer. And then one that has shot up the board that I didn't expect to be there, but it's a tie between either the pineapple or the creamy coconut. The creamy coconut's really come on strong lately. I really like that one.
I can't picture that one being good. Grape. I'm a fellow grapey, so I appreciate
the
grape
grape is top 2 easily.
Are you able to, because we're going to go record another podcast after this, actually, are you just able to tell our listeners once more where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do?
Right. So my Twitter handle is at C2_Cooper. If you go to my handle, you'll find the link to the Patreon. It's patreon.com/basketballsherewrote. There is content there that's unlocked if you just want to do kind of a, look around and go browse and see what it's all about. You can look there. And then I'd also obviously be very happy to have you if you want to subscribe and get the content that's locked and participate in my mailbag. Send me questions. I love answering questions from the patrons every month. So come visit.
Do it. The link is in the podcast and YouTube description. I've heard from creators that our listeners have been good about subscribing. So I expect to hear from Caitlin that she had droves of new subscribers.
That's how influential you are. That's how influential you are.
That, or they're just the guests are blowing smoke towards me, which is also fine. Caitlin, thank you so much for doing this. I will talk to you again very soon.